There's no place like home, but what happens when your home doesn't want you anymore? This is what happens when you're banned from your own country. Formerly known as exile, it's a punishment that has been discarded by the modern world in favor of more traditional punishments, such as either the death penalty or imprisonment. Per the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the punishment of exile is technically illegal, not to mention largely impractical given that exile is typically a punishment for individuals seen as a threat to the current government. Modern mass media gives these individuals a platform no matter the country of origin, so authoritarian countries such as China and Iran simply imprison or murder political dissidents. However, the state of Georgia, who likes to occasionally pretend it's still 1820, actually has a law in the books where criminals face the punishment of banishment. The Georgia state constitution forbids banishment outside of the state though, and thus criminals are instead banished from all but one of the state's 158 counties, with Eccles County being the only county criminals charged with various crimes such as drug possession or sale, burglary, stalking, assault or battery, prostitution, or making terror threats to a judge can live. Instead, most criminals simply choose to leave the state altogether. But that's not the only U.S. state to practice banishment. 16 states have constitutional provisions against banishment, and in states without these provisions, appeals courts have generally shot down the sentence. Tennessee, which rarely realizes it's not 1820, still allows permanent exile from the state, and Maryland's constitution prescribes it for the crime of corruption, the thinking being that a corrupt public official has no business remaining in the state and within the systems they used for their advantage. But while outright exiles are largely illegal, the nuances of banishment see it used as a punishment in specific situations. Exiling an American citizen from their own country is unconstitutional, but the United States regularly deports non-nationals and forbids them from re-entry. Should these individuals re-enter, they are either immediately deported again or sometimes imprisoned. An individual may be banished from areas around schools or daycare facilities depending on their crime though, and this is an increasingly popular punishment in the U.S. Gang members are also sometimes banished from their hometowns in an effort to try and disconnect them from the very influences that turn them the way they are. Given a lot of gangs' national reach though, this is likely rather limited in effectiveness and is probably counterintuitive to rehabilitation. Banishment can often cut someone off from their support networks in the form of family and friends, and has proven repeatedly without these support networks, the odds of reformation plummet dramatically. Banishment or exile, however, has a long history that stretches back to the very dawn of human civilization. While its place in Western penal codes can be traced back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, the practice was widespread throughout the world long before that. The punishment was considered more humane than outright execution, but in the dark days of antiquity could very likely still be a death sentence, with communities so far apart and other towns or villages largely xenophobic towards strangers. Banishment would force someone to wander the wilderness and attempt to live on their own. Survival is pretty tough stuff, and even tougher when you're alone. Cut off from a community's support, starvation, injury, or illness would quickly claim banished individuals. Banishment was a very effective measure for a long time. The punishment was as dreaded as a death sentence, and having a family member or close friend who is exiled would be a humiliating affair. In the necessary tight-knit communities of the past, this would severely erode one's social standing, which could affect everything from regular business affairs to marriage propositions. An entire family could be condemned by the shame of exile, as others ostracized the remaining family members and marriage proposals were declined. In the case that the exiled individual was the head of the household, though, the condemnation of the family could be quite literal. Without a breadwinner, a family would quickly fall to poverty, and with no community support, might well face death from starvation. Thus, sometimes entire families would follow the individual into exile. Better to work together at survival in the wild than to slowly starve to death and die off in the village. However, as time wore on and human settlements increased in number and size, the effectiveness of exile as a punishment began to diminish. A banished individual could simply make their way to another community, ideally a larger one where they would become lost in the crowd. Smaller communities might still have trade ties, and thus word would spread from one to another, making an exiled individual unwelcome in their neighboring village. As villages grew into cities, though, the large metropolitan spaces gave plenty of room for one to lose themselves and their past amongst the mass of humanity. In Roman times, exile would regularly be practiced on individuals who hadn't quite deserved a death sentence, or perhaps in response to petitions for leniency by influential individuals. Given the bloodthirsty nature of Roman culture, though, exile was actually implemented to help curb the amount of capital punishment handed out by the state. Exile also allowed a degree of flexibility as opposed to death, which was rather final. Thus, an individual could be exiled from cities, regions, or even the empire outright, with the punishment more fairly matching the crime. Sometimes these punishments were temporary, other times they were permanent, and an individual could even opt for exile in order to avoid a worse punishment. The mildest form of banishment in Roman culture was relegation, and was widely used on undesirable foreigners. The decree would simply demand that an individual or group leave Rome altogether, or a specific specific province for a certain length of time. Sometimes this could be for life, but unlike other forms of banishment, relegation still allowed Roman citizens to retain their civil rights. The more severe form of banishment was aquae et ignis interdicto, which meant debarred from fire and water. This form of banishment could also be for a specific length of time or for life, but the condemned suffered a further penalty. They lost all rights as a Roman citizen for the duration. This included property, which would often be confiscated by the state. Even if one was not exiled from the entirety of Rome, living within the empire without the protection of Roman civil rights was a rather perilous affair. Deportation was the most severe form of banishment, and in this case the individual was immediately arrested and forced into exile out of the empire. Often this meant the individual was sent to live on a remote Mediterranean island, where it was reasonably certain they would never be able to return from. Should the exiled somehow find their way off the island, though, re-entering Rome would often lead straight to capital punishment. Exile quickly grew in popularity in Rome and became the default punishment for anyone seen as threatening the established way of Roman life and public morality. To that end, Jews, philosophers preaching non-state-sponsored ideologies, magicians, dancers, actors, poets, and astrologers would commonly face exile, with most of the victims being men. Most of these exiles, though, didn't face deportatio or even aquae et ignis interdicto, as they were allowed to retain their property, but rather they were simply told to stay a certain distance outside of a specific city, province, or the empire itself. As they were allowed to retain their property, those banished could sell their property off to fund their journey and start a new life. Fast forward to the Age of Sail, though, and several countries saw exile or transportation as an extremely effective way of expanding their global power. During the Age of Sail, European powers began setting up colonies all over the world, most notably in the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia. However, the colonial powers faced one rather big problem. Few people were willing to make often months-long journeys to live somewhere relatively uncivilized. Fewer yet were willing to actually stay there long-term. Soon, European courts came up with an elegant solution: simply send people against their will. European penal code during this time was absolutely out of control, with England itself having well over 100 offenses punishable by death. By simply changing some of these punishments from death to transportation, European powers generated a veritable army of unwilling laborers to help expand their colonial power around the world. In England, people were being sent to the American colonies as a punishment since 1654, but with the passing of the Transportation Act of 1717, the number of forcibly transported individuals quickly skyrocketed. Criminals were still being sent to America until the very outbreak of the War of Independence, when the Americans won their freedom with the thanks of the French. The British were faced with a serious problem: where to send thousands of unwanted criminals? The answer presented itself shortly after the discovery of Australia. In May 1787, 11 ships left from Portsmouth with 736 convicts on board. 40 of them died during the incredible 8-month journey to the land down under. That hardly stopped British courts from ordering many more people to their Australian colonies, though, and the population of convicts versus actual settlers was exponentially larger, something that made regular settlers rather uncomfortable. Most of these convicts, though, were eligible to return to England after a set amount of time, typically 7 to 14 years. But this came with a huge catch. While forced to work in penal colonies building basic infrastructure for nascent colonies, prisoners earned no money. Thus, when their sentence was up, they faced a rather difficult task of paying for a ticket back home. Some were lucky to have family that could secure them a voyage back home, but most simply opted just to stay and build a new life in Australia. This was not an accident, but had always been carefully considered by British courts, who knew growing thriving colonies in most far-flung parts of the world would be incredibly difficult. But most of these criminals weren't as bad as one might assume. Most of these facing banishment were accused of theft, and this punishment was doled out regularly for even the most petty of larcenies. Children were frequently charged with theft for simply stealing an apple, and could very realistically face the possibility of transportation for it. Other convicts were protesters, or individuals seen as troublemakers in the eyes of the law. Only about 15% of those facing transportation were women, though, making things rather grim for any men forced to remain behind after their sentence. Once in Australia, convicts would be put to work building roads and other public works. They were integral to the building of basic infrastructure in budding colonies, and were usually assigned to a free settler in the same way that Southern Americans used slaves, though British convicts in exile did have certain rights that, in theory, at least protected them. In practice, these rights were largely ignored by their settler overseers, and local authorities were not very often concerned with the welfare of convicts. Sometimes, though, settlers would face punishment for the abuse of convicts, but the sheer distance between the colonies and England meant the enforcement of civil rights for convicts was rather lax. Punishments could run from increased sentences to whippings or beatings. Those who were viewed as particularly troublesome would be sentenced to work in even more remote settlements as part of a chain gang. However, this life wasn't all that that bad for some of the convicts, as many a free settler treated their convicts much like hired hands rather than slaves. This could make a long sentence much more endurable, and the bonds of community would make the convicts' transition from prisoner to settler much easier, enticing them further to simply stay. Some could even earn reduced sentences for good behavior, earning their freedom after 4 years. However, this did not include a ticket home, and thus most convicts were simply forced to stay. If you're an Australian citizen today, odds are good you descended from one of these prisoners. Banishment and exile have largely fallen out of favor throughout the world though, and most exiles today are voluntary. The Dalai Lama, for example, is a voluntary exile from his home of Tibet, having fled after the Chinese government invaded and forcibly annexed the country. Given that he's a figure of Tibetan freedom though, had he remained behind, it almost is certain that he would have been imprisoned for life or simply killed, as has happened with many other religious figures the Chinese government viewed as troublesome. Napoleon Bonaparte, though, might be the most famous exile in history, having been exiled twice after Europe asked him to kindly stop trying to take over the world. After being defeated the first time, he was sent to exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba in 1813, but with the help of supporters managed to return to France to wage a new war. After his second defeat, he was once more exiled, and there he'd die, never to return to glory again. Now, exile your boredom with what actually happened to prisoners sent to Australia, or click this other video instead.